Good day to one and all. We are here to present a seminar on the topic Sri Lankan economic crisis. Myself Sharath. My team members are Saumisri, Akshay, Akshaya, Swapna, Shweta.
I'm Akshara.
I'm Saumisri.
I'm Akshay.
I'm Shweta.
I'm Swapna.
How did Sri Lanka ended up in economic crisis? The actual crisis started since the end of 2019. But then if you see, Sri Lanka's foreign debt started rising since 2010. It is widely believed that Sri Lanka fell into this kind of economic crisis due to the short-sightedness of their corrupt politicians. When civil war ended up in 2009, corruption and authoritarian attitude has reached new heights under the rule of former President Mahinda Rajapaksa from 2005 to 2015. After Mahinda Rajapaksa, Maithripala Sirisena became the president of Sri Lanka, and after 2019, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa was elected, and he is also the brother of Mahinda Rajapaksa. Rajapaksas are four brothers and they pretty much control the entire Sri Lankan government, and it is also said that the whole Rajapaksa family controlled almost 70% of the entire Sri Lankan budget. In 2016, President Maithripala Sirisena publicly said that half of Sri Lanka's public procurement contracts are tainted by bribery and corruption. And then in 2018, President Maithripala Sirisena's own chief of staff and other officials were arrested for taking bribe. And then in 2017, December, the Sri Lankan Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, he officially handed over the strategic southern port of Hanbantota to China on a 99-year lease. The reason he handed over the lease to China is because the government realized that it will be difficult for them to repay the Chinese loan that they took to build the seaport, and this is the Chinese debt trap diplomacy. As this deal was done by the Prime Minister, President Maithripala Sirisena removed the Prime Minister and appointed Mahinda Rajapaksa as the Prime Minister, who was the former President of Sri Lanka. So we see how the family is running the Sri Lankan government. Everyone is corrupt, right from the President to the Prime Minister. Everything that is happening today in Sri Lanka is a resultant of what went wrong since 2009. After 2010, there was a sharp rise in Sri Lanka's external debt. All this external debt includes money borrowed from countries like China, Japan, India, international financial institutions like the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, in the name of infrastructure projects. Another reason for economic crisis is last year in 2021, the Sri Lankan government has banned the usage of all chemical fertilizers, pesticides, weedicides, and fungicides. It was a move by the government to push the agricultural sector towards the organic farming. Sri Lankan president takes up this challenge in making the country first in the world to completely eliminate the use of chemical fertilizers. In fact, the decision turns out to be a disaster, and crop production of Sri Lanka started declining. Domestic rice production fell 20% in just the first 6 months. Sri Lanka, long self-sufficient in rice production, has been forced to import $450 million worth of rice, even as domestic prices for this staple of the nation surged by around 50%. The ban also devastated the nation's tea crop, its primary export and source of foreign exchange. Furthermore, the price of food went up because the food mafia people started hoarding essential food items like rice, sugar, pulses for making money, so which leads to an increase in inflation from 12 to 13%.
Is going through one of the worst crises of its history. Food has become scarce, prices have shot through the roof, and the long power cuts have turned their lives into an ordinary Sri Lankans upside down. The economic meltdown has also captured the country into a political crisis as the people demand answers and accountability from the government. The price of vegetables have doubled in recent weeks, whereas wheat and rice have been sold for rupees 220 or 190 per kilogram, respectively. Inflation and the weakened currency has sent price of basic essential Sri Lankan to etc. So citizens are queuing up to buy basic goods as food, fuel, and medicine, etc. Most of the time, they may leave empty-handed as their shops run out of goods. Students, the outline stopped printing publications due to paper shortages and switched to e-papers. which leads to the cancellation of exam of the students, which lead to a major failure in the education system. And the unavailability of books, an essential requirement for education, schools and colleges were shut down. Education. Several schools in Sri Lanka announced that their term examination would be postponed due to the paper shortages throughout the country. Due to the acute shortage of printing papers, ink, ribbon, a decision was made to either cancel or postpone the exam. Medical. All scheduled surgeries the hospitals went due to a shortage of medical have also reduced a large number of laboratory tests. Hospitals had begun to run out of endotracheal tubes for the ventilation of newborn babies. The Sri Lankan Medical Association said that all the hospitals in the country no longer had to access to improved medical tools and vital drugs. Hospitals were pushed to the extent they have decided to sterilize and reuse endotracheal tubes to deliver oxygen to the lungs of newborn babies.
Good evening to one and all. As Sharath and Akshay said, Sri Lanka is going through one of its worst economic crises in the last 73 years. Why are they facing economic crisis? For that, we should know their economic history. Before that, we all have some misconception about Sri Lanka that they are extremely poor country and they are neither a developing country. But the same Sri Lanka has showed a good performance in the economic sector. The per capita income of the country is twice that of India. And when we look into the Human Development Index, when India ranked 131, but Sri Lanka had ranked 72. So in all these fields, Sri Lanka showed a good performance. Then what happened to Sri Lanka? And now we will discuss about the causes and factors that leads to the Sri Lankan economic crisis. Hi guys, I'm Shweta. Okay, so what exactly is this economic problem faced by Sri Lanka? The key problem with the Sri Lankan economy is that it is quickly running out of its foreign reserves. Their foreign exchange reserves had dropped from $7.5 billion in 2019 to around only $2.8 billion in July of 2021. As you know, Sri Lanka is a country which imports everything from milk powder to oil. All the imports were restricted and which causes inflation. The another reason is external debt and corruption. As Akshay said, you can see in the graph, after 2010, there was a sharp rise in the Sri Lanka's external debt. All these external debt includes money borrowed from countries like China, Japan, India, and international financial institutions like World Bank and Asian Development Bank. To repay them, they again borrowed. That's what the political leaders were continuing for the last few years. For what and why they borrowed? That shows the stupidity done by the leaders. They invested these monies on non-profitable projects. One of them says Matala Rajapaksa International Airport at Hampantota. The current situation of that airport gives it the world's deserted airport title. How pity, right? As Akshay said, during in this time period, the Rajapaksa family were in power, so naturally they benefited heavily, and that's why the whole country corruption level increased in Sri Lanka to an extent that today it's facing its worst economic crisis. The next is tourism. You have to understand that Sri Lanka has an economy that is heavily reliant on travel and tourism. In fact, tourism contributes more than 10% to its GDP. In 2019, the terrorist attack named Easter bombing affected the tourism in Sri Lanka. And taking when the pandemic COVID-19 fell, the tourists that loved sitting on the beaches of Sri Lanka were nowhere to be seen. And the tourism industry took a heavy beating and shrank by 10. According to the data from Trading Economics, while Sri Lanka earned a revenue of $455 million a month during the pre-pandemic days, it went down to a very sorry figure of just $3 million in July 2021. However, that was not the only cause of this crisis. The another reason is tax cut and money creation. To meet the inflation, the government did another stupidity called money creation. The government starts to print more Sri Lankan currency. It leads to the terrible devaluation of the Sri Lankan rupees in the international market. Before the crisis, $1 equals to 120, 160 to 170 Sri Lankan rupees, which became 230 Sri Lankan rupees. Another is tax cut. According to the election manifesto of Rajapaksa, they gave tax cut to the people. As a part of this, more than 30% of the people get this tax cut. Due to this, the international rating agency lowered the Sri Lankan credit rating. Then comes the Russian-Ukraine war. It is an external cause and not made by Sri Lankans. All the tourists came to Sri Lanka is 1 in 4 from Russia and Ukraine. All came to static. As a part of this, oil price hiked. One barrel prices 130 rupees. As a result, oil import decreases and oil price increases. I think all are pretty much clear about the causes that leads to Sri Lankan economic crisis.
How China involved in this issue? Cheating policies. China provided $7 billion in loans and in investment, including loans for the construction of a port in Hambantota. Sri Lanka cannot afford these loans since the nation is currently $64 billion in debt and using roughly 95% of government's revenue to pay back loans. Hambantota port was financed through Chinese loans and built by a Chinese company. In this case, a port in Hambantota, two countries have recently come to a deal with Sri Lanka, selling 80% stake via 99 years lease in this port. China wants to establish their power in Sri Lanka for this reason. They gave massive loans to Sri Lanka. China is also building 50,000 acres in industrial zone near Hambantota port, in which it will have a major stake and will also be ceded to China for 99 years. This expands land if granted will be the Hambantota region, which has been a punchline of sorts over the past couple of years in Sri Lanka due to its massive and expensive infrastructure projects. Both of these projects have led to fears among the local population that the area will become a Chinese colony. This has led to the violent protest by locals, including Buddhist monks, against the port and the industrial zone, who stand to lose their lands. Next, military equipments to Sri Lanka. China has been a continuing source of military equipments to Sri Lanka and is helping to modernize expand the Sri Lanka Armed Force. China exports military equipments to Sri Lanka military, including anti-tank guided missiles, rockets, launchers, and deep penetration bombs, and rockets, night vision devices, armor, motors, etc. The China National Aero Technology Import-Export Corporation is helped the Sri Lanka government in constructing an aircraft maintenance center. Chinese nuclear submarines have made several visits to the Sri Lanka in September and November, despite strong displeasure from the Indian government. Threatening India. Most of the Indian neighbors have fallen prey to China debt trap. BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, which seeks to improve connectivity among countries in Asia, Africa, and Europe. China through BRI can increase India's political cost of dealing with its neighbors. At last, the Laos, it was one of the country who had got debt trapped by China. Laos has borrowed heavily to invest in Mekong River hydropower projects, as well as the $6 billion high-speed rail project. The train's cost is financed through an Export-Import Bank of China loan.
So good evening all. So next is we are moving on to the history of Sri Lanka. So do you think history repeats? Just come and we will look into it. So Sri Lanka. What is Sri Lanka? We know that Sri Lanka is a multinational state home to diverse cultures, languages and ethnicities just like in India. So when we look into Sri Lanka, we can see that the majority group is Sinhalese, and we can also see that there is a large minority groups which are Tamilians. So what is Sri Lanka? Sri Lanka is a democratic republic and unitary state which is governed by a semi-presidential system. Here we can see that one family, that is the Rajapaksa family, is prominent in politics, and this family occupies the senior positions in the Sri Lankan state. So when we see into its history, on 4th February 1948, Sri Lanka got its independence. Do you think the independence is still valid? So before that, there is a party, that is one liberation groups which ruled Sri Lanka in 1970s. That is the LTTE. the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, which are a militant separatist groups fighting for an independent homeland for Hindu Tamils in northeastern Sri Lanka. So why do you think they formed? They mainly formed this is due to the continuous discrimination and violent persecution against Sri Lankan Tamils, which is formed by the Sinhalese dominant, that is Sri Lankan government. So this mainly formed in 1970s. So when we see that in 1985, the negotiations started with Sri Lankan government due to this discrimination. On 16th May 2009, Mahinda Rajapakse declared victory over the Tigers. But we can see that we forgot to see that the Mahinda Rajapakse family declared his victory over the Tigers, which is over the Sri Lankans. So before crisis in 2015 presidential election, they have been accused of authoritarianism, corruption, nepotism, and bad governance. This leads to bad performance in the president's election. So in 2019 presidential election, Gotabaya Rajapakse, brother of Mahinda, contest and won. So we altogether we can see that their actions caused the economic crisis in 2019, as Akshay said. We can see that their economic crisis in 2019 is mainly caused due to the politics, resulting in Sri Lanka's defaulting on its debt for the first time in its post-independence history.
Let's move on to the last topic, how to tackle the Sri Lankan financial crisis. Before going through that, there arises a question, has there any country other than Sri Lanka had gone through such a financial crisis? The answer is yes. A lot of countries face such a financial crisis and some of them are still struggling to cope up with that. Syria, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, and now Pakistan is also one among them. But there are countries who successfully overcome the issue. One of them is the greatest and our beloved country, India, and the another one is Greece. Let's see how India tackles the problem. The 1991 Indian economic crisis was mainly due to the collapse of Soviet bloc, Gulf wars, swelled imports, which leads the deficit of balance of payment. Government of India's immediate response was to secure an emergency loan of $2.2 billion from the IMF by pledging 67 tons of India's gold reserve as collateral security. Reserve Bank of India had to airlift 47 tons of gold to the Bank of England and 20 tons of gold to the Union Bank of Switzerland to raise $600 million. The Chandrasekhar government had collapsed a few months after having authorized the airlift. The move helped tide over the balance of payment crisis and kick-started the next economic reform process. This policy has yielded amazing results, dramatically improving the quality of life in India. Greece also made a remarkable economic recovery with the help of IMF. IMF stands for International Monetary Fund. Back to Sri Lankan issue, the one and only solution for Sri Lanka's economic crisis is IMF bailout. IMF bailout. Bailout basically means asking financial assistance in order to save any business, or in this case, you can say save the country's economy from collapsing. Sri Lankan government is asking this kind of financial assistance on deferring loan repayment. Deferring payment basically means an agreement between the lender and borrower where the borrower requests the lender to give the loan and that loan will be repaid at a later date when situation would be comparatively better. IMF bailout can help the country to overcome financial crisis, but for flourishing Sri Lanka, they need an independent and efficient democratic system. Thank you one and all. Have a wonderful day.